Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. I want to look at an issue today that is a little bit more complex, and so we're going to use two videos to describe the full answer to this question. You're the buyer broker. You have a buyer brokerage services agreement with your client, but you know you are going to be unavailable to service this buyer for some period of time. You're going on vacation, you're going to have surgery, whatever the case may be. You're going to be unavailable to tour properties with this buyer, and you need somebody else to do it for you. So the prudent thing to do is to set somebody up in advance to take care of your buyer's needs. It doesn't always work that way. It might be that you are just in the middle of the busiest day of your whole life when your buyer client calls and says, I really want to go see a property that just came on the market today and I want to see it now. And you simply can't go show that property. And so you have to send somebody else. Here's the question. Must that broker who goes to show the property separately create an agency relationship with your buyer, even though you already have a buyer brokerage services agreement in place with your buyer? And the answer to that question is yes. And what we're going to talk about in this video is what it looks like to create that agency relationship between the buyer and the new broker. And in another video, we are going to look at how you complete the forms to create that outcome. So let's say that the broker you're going to ask to cover for you and show your buyer client properties while you're unavailable is licensed to your firm. That means that your firm has already entered a buyer brokerage services agreement with the client. And in that buyer brokerage services agreement, your firm and the buyer client have agreed that you are an agent of the buyer, but nobody else in your firm other than your supervising managing brokers represents the buyer. No other agent represents the buyer. So in order for another agent in your office, another broker in your office to show this buyer homes, to tour homes with the buyer, to use the NAR rule language, the other broker must establish an agency relationship with the buyer as well. The form you would use to do that is Form 41A. Under Form 41A is an amendment to the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. There is a provision where you can simply identify an additional agent of the buyer. You would identify the second agent's name. And if you wanted to limit the duration of that second agent's representation of the buyer to the time period that you know you'll be unavailable, then you could do so in the other section of the Form 41A. So if the buyer broker that you're going to have assist you is in your firm, you're going to use a Form 41A to amend your existing buyer brokerage services agreement. But let's say that the buyer broker who's going to assist you is licensed to another firm. When you ask the broker who's licensed to another firm to assist your client, you cannot simply amend your firm's buyer brokerage services agreement to name that agent, because there's absolutely no way that your firm can extend agency to a broker who's not licensed to your firm. Your firm can only extend agency to a broker who's licensed to your firm, which means that the other broker licensed to another firm, their firm is going to have to also enter a buyer brokerage services agreement with that buyer. That buyer is going to sign a separate buyer brokerage services agreement, Form 41, with the same buyer who's already signed a buyer brokerage services agreement with your firm, naming that broker as an agent of the buyer. Now, the buyer has two buyer brokerage services agreements and two different agents representing the buyer, two different agents and two different firms, two different buyer brokerage services agreements. Perhaps you're thinking to yourself, how do we have this buyer sign two different buyer brokerage services agreements without being obligated to pay compensation to two buyer brokers? That's what we're going to discuss in the next video. If you have questions on what we've talked about so far or any other topic, please ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.